Welcome to Emerging Tech Horizons. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this edition with Sean Carberry, who is our Managing Editor right here at NDIA at the National Defense Magazine, a role that you've had since April.
Correct.
And Sean joins us after a long career in both journalism and also in government, which I think is actually kind of unique that you've had both experiences, have seen defense journalism, frankly, from both sides. You were at the Department of Defense for almost 4 years. You were managing editor for the Office of the Inspector General Overseas Contingency Operations, senior writer editor, also in the Office of the Inspector General for Overseas Contingency Operations. You came to that job with a background in defense reporting in various venues. I see you wrote for PBS NewsHour and some other notable media outlets. So, Sean, first, welcome to NDIA. We're delighted to have you on the team, and looking forward to talking to you about your career and your experiences, and especially as it relates to emerging technologies.
Great. Happy to talk.
So, can we start off talking a little bit about your career? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. I mean, as you noted, I've sort of bounced around a little bit. I have been predominantly a journalist for the last 2 decades or so, with a couple of detours here and there. The most notable one was the time that I spent at the Defense Department Inspector General's office, which in a lot of ways was kind of a very natural transition and extension of the work I'd done as a journalist. So, in particular, I spent 2.5 years in Afghanistan for NPR. I was their last correspondent based in Afghanistan. We closed the bureau at the end of 2014, and then that experience sort of played into my work at the Inspector General's office, where I was working on a portfolio of quarterly reports on what were called overseas contingency operations. So Afghanistan, the counter-ISIS operation in Iraq and Syria, as well as some other operations. There was one in the Philippines for a while, and some counterterrorism operations in Africa. And so in that role, I was doing oversight reporting, so sort of government journalism, essentially, on these operations. So we would do quarterly questionnaires and information gathering with the Defense Department and the various commands that were conducting the operations. And these reports were also a co-production, essentially, with the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development offices of Inspector General. So we collectively did this comprehensive oversight reporting on these operations. And so that was, again, about 3.5 years or so of doing that. After that, I decided to take a little bit of a life transition and took about a year off to write a book about my experiences doing combat reporting and reporting in hostile environments, and then came back into the workforce and found this opportunity.
Great.
So again, just continuation of really looking at military and national security through a variety of lenses.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book? When is it coming out?
Yeah. So it'll be out next summer.
Okay.
The title is called Passport Stamps: Searching the World for a War to Call Home. And so it's sort of about my personal journey of what motivated me to pursue war reporting, why I wanted to get into that sort of field of journalism, focusing on hostile environments, fragile states, things like that. And then sort of the learning curve of going through it, of being in over my head, of having ambitions greater than my aptitude at times. And also, really sort of learning the craft of doing that work and recognizing the importance of it, the obligation to the people that you're reporting on in those places, and also a discussion about sort of the mental and emotional health impacts of doing that work. So it's sort of a multi-layered thing where there's some, certainly lighthearted bits about some of my misadventures, but also very much peeling back the curtain on that kind of work, the community of people who do that work, and as I say, some of the different motivations of myself and others in that space, and how that work affects you as a person.
So, as someone who personally started out on a career path that didn't necessarily include defense, then I wound up in defense and in the Pentagon and back in the Pentagon. I'm really fascinated also by how you made the jump from a career in journalism, admittedly reporting on defense, to actually inside the department. How can you tell us a little bit about how that all occurred?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was actually fairly quick and fairly easy. It was at a time I was working for an outlet covering the Defense Department and intelligence agencies, focusing on sort of cyber and IT in the defense world, and keeping an eye out for other opportunities. And it just it came across my radar basically that the Inspector General office was looking for a lead writer for Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of the work, I mean, the skill set and all of that is identical to what I'd been doing.
Yeah.
And I just felt that it was an important topic that, having spent a lot of time on the ground there, investing a lot of energy into it, that I felt that, from a public service standpoint, that was something that I wanted to do, and felt, again, it was important to do that kind of work to really keep attention on Afghanistan, on what was being done. And, frankly, coming from a perspective of spending time on the ground and
Yeah.
seeing a lot of things not going well, and hearing a lot of talking points that were making it sound like things were going well.
Hmm.
And so, the importance of transparency and informing Congress and the American people about what's going on, to try to hopefully inform better policy decisions. So, I applied, and was actually hired very quickly because they were using accepted service. Because of the nature of that office, it
Mm.
was kind of an expeditionary type of office designed to expand and contract as new operations come and go. So they were able to use expedited hiring authority. So actually, I started within about 2 months of when I initially applied.
Excellent. For what it's worth, for both of my stints in the Pentagon, I actually found that the most effective public affairs folks were the ones who had come out of backgrounds in journalism. I had some really good folks who supported the things that I was involved in, and so again, I think it's great that you did that. I hope the department appreciated it. I want to switch gears a little bit. So
Mhm.
I've got
Sure.
a copy of National Defense Magazine. You're now a senior with the magazine.
Mhm.
Um, Tell us what we should expect to see from National Defense Magazine, and especially in the area of emerging technologies. Do you anticipate changes? Your own stamp?
I wouldn't say any substantial changes. I mean, I think the focus of the magazine, from my experience so far, is and will continue to be a mix of sort of current and emerging, looking at modernization in particular, about where things are going, where the spend is going, where the needs are. So I think that's our wheelhouse, and where we have been focusing, and I think we'll continue to, as the Defense Department, as the nation, is looking at this pivot from 2 decades of counterterrorism
Hmm.
focus to a higher end potential fight with peer and near peer adversaries, and the technologies and organizational approaches needed to confront that. I think that's going to be the center of the conversation for quite a while.
Yeah.
But obviously, the emerging technologies is front and center, both in terms of what's happening now, what's being fielded now, versus the longer term, looking at 5, 10, 20 years down the road, what the technologies, what the domains are going to look like.
Right. So along those lines, I think most of our viewers and listeners are primarily focused on the emerging technologies area. So I'm curious, from your reporter's standpoint, how do you handle trying to digest what can sometimes be highly technical content and honestly, scientists and engineers aren't always the best at explaining what they
Mhm.
do. But how do you handle that, and how do you report it in a way that the intelligent readers of National Defense magazine can truly understand the issues?
Sure, and I mean that's a constant challenge in journalism in any field, whether you're a business journalist or national defense or technology. One of the things is certainly that the national defense audience is more literate in these things than you could say the general population. Right? So
Hmm.
we are writing to a certain base level of understanding to start with, but accepting that, yes, you do have to translate things sometimes between expert speak
Yeah.
and reader comprehension. And some of that honestly is just sort of the natural process as journalists of ourselves trying to understand things. I mean, I don't have a degree in physics or chemistry or high tech. I mean, I'm reasonably literate and can understand things and can understand when I don't quite know what someone's talking about to ask a question. And I think that that's a key part of it is in the process of interviewing people is really trying to, sort of pull back, say, okay, explain this for someone who doesn't do
Right.
this for a living. So that's one part of the role is really trying to tease that out of people you're talking to. But sometimes you don't necessarily have that luxury. If you're pulling something from a speech, you do have to then, take some time and look at, all right, how do I explain this? And every once in a while you are in a situation where you do have to write something that you don't fully understand yourself.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but you recognize, okay, this is correct. This is what the person said. I've run it by other people to verify. It's a little over my head, but this is the important thing that needs to be conveyed.
Yeah.
So um, it's a constant effort to kind of make sure that you're representing the information accurately, considering the audience's needs, level of literacy on the topic, things like that, and then kind of bridge that. And so some things again easier than others when you get into really technical stuff. I mean, there are times sometimes I'm editing a piece written by one of my colleagues, and I'll really have to kind of stop,
Hmm.
step aside, Google some things
Mhm,
myself
mhm.
to get my literacy up on it, and then realize, okay, yes, this is correct, it's accurate, it's the right balance between technical detail and sort of lay explanation that that works for the audience.
Yeah, no, understood. And look, we face some of the same issues with Emerging Technologies Institute. How do we communicate information? I think, especially our NDIA members who are tracking what we're doing at ETI, they tend to be interested in technology. Obviously, that's where they're tracking us. They don't always have expertise in a given area. You might have someone who's interested in AI, but they work in directed energy, for example, or maybe they don't have a technical background, but they're involved in business development in some way. And so I think we face a very similar challenge in some of the work that we do. So along those lines, one of the things that we also tried to do at ETI, and I'm wondering if you've had a similar experience, kind of separating out fact from fiction. There are technologies and technologists who get, shall we say, sometimes overly enthusiastic about what they can deliver. So as a journalist, as a reporter, as a writer, how do you handle sorting through what's real and what's hype?
Yeah, again, that gets to the core of doing the job is you talk to someone, they say a bunch of things, and you have to kind of take it in, process it, and look at, okay, this is fact, this is empirical. There is data, there is observation, there is something to it, and I'll put it in the context, for example, of reporting in Afghanistan.
Hmm.
Similar challenges, obviously different than technology, but there you would have situations where you're interviewing an officer who's saying XYZ, right? The Afghan forces did this or are capable of this. And you have to look at, okay, what's observable, what's measurable, what's subjective, and where do I apply skepticism or qualification to it.
Right.
And that is an obligation of the craft of journalism, is that kind of questioning and saying, okay, there is data that show that Afghan forces conducted 50 operations last week.
Hmm.
You can say, okay, that's a fact. I'm fine with that. Now, the commander telling you that says they were highly effective.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what's your criteria for that?
Yeah.
How are you assessing what is highly effective? And that's when you get into kind of teasing things out, where something can be said and presented as they conducted a lot of operations, and that sounds like a positive. But if the operations didn't have any significant results, and if an operation is defined as they left the base, marched through a village, and came back,
Yeah.
okay, that's a successful operation, but did it change the security environment? Did they capture any enemy fighters? Did they uncover weapons? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
these things where, again, you can present a fact and present it as a positive, but it doesn't give you really a clear picture. And so that's a lot of what I did both in Afghanistan and at the Inspector General's office, where we would get information from the command saying they did this, they're capable of this, and then you start kind of peeling away at some of these things, and you realize often what happens is people, they convey what they can measure,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like you can say they did 50 operations. Well, that's an output,
Mhm.
right? That's not an outcome. Did the operations make security better?
Yeah.
Well, that's harder to measure, because then we have to do surveying of populations and other things. Well, okay. And so that's why a lot of things that are presented as fact are fact, but they really don't give you much of a picture. It's raw data. So I think some of those things, again, over time, the more people you speak to, you get used to hearing things and saying, okay, that's measurable, factual data that says this device can fly this fast. Okay, but over what range, and how vulnerable is it to detection, jamming, what have you.
Right.
So again, technology can meet a certain need and sound great, but once you start looking at, okay, when you put it in a contested environment, how does it do?
Yeah.
Well, that's another 10,
And
15 years down the road
yeah.
before it can operate there.
Yeah.
So definitely part of the challenge, and so it's just that nature where you kind of have to, you take it in, look at what is concrete, and then start looking at where's the subjective nature of it, and where are the second, third order questions that aren't being addressed by this data presented.
That's very. I can tell you example after example that I've seen where that along similar lines. For example, the one that would get me going is people would tell me, we had a successful flight test. Okay, great. How did you define success? And then you find out that success was defined that the store separated off the wing of the aircraft. Okay, so you just proved Isaac Newton was right. We've known that for 300 plus years. How have you advanced the state of the art? That absolutely resonates. Let me switch gears a little bit. So you've been, outside the building, inside the building. One issue that we hear over and over again is that the department has an overclassification problem. Do you think we've got an overclassification problem? Are you think we're doing the right things and balancing national security, uh, protecting information from adversaries at the same time being as transparent as we should be? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the short, immediate answer is yes. There is a classification problem,
Mhm.
and you hear this, I mean, from everyone on the inside and the outside. You hear it from officials in government. You hear it from Congress. You hear it from the media. There is an instinct and a bias to overclassify.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really any question about that. It's I have a bit of an iconoclastic view as a journalist because of having worked on the inside, and having seen and worked with classified material, and you appreciate what is classified and why it should be, and the absolute, compelling national security need that, yes, there are many things that have to be classified at varying levels, but you can always see examples of things that you look at this and say, what harm to national security would come from the public seeing this,
Mhm.
and what would be the benefit to the public of seeing this? And again, back to the Afghanistan or Iraq counterterrorism lenses. For me, we had a lot of battles over this
Mhm.
with the department about things that they would respond to our questions and say, well, that's controlled unclassified information, that's secret, that's top secret. And you look at it and say, okay, well, why? What's the criteria?
Yeah.
And yeah, some things very clear and obvious. And, anything operational, certain things that reveal how you got the sources and methods, things like that. But some of the more subjective things about, okay, the capabilities of Afghan forces,
Yeah.
right? There were a lot of just open secrets about the Afghan army and Afghan police and their capabilities. The talking points would always say they're making progress, they're able to do this, they're conducting 80% of operations independently. But then when you go out and you see Afghan police at a checkpoint who are taking drugs and not paying attention to their surroundings,
Yeah.
that's something that you observe
Mhm. Mhm.
empirically.
Mm.
And some of those kinds of things, there would be efforts to, tamp down reporting of that. And some of the argument would be, well, it helps the adversary if they know that Afghan forces are not as capable. And sort of the counter argument I always make is, well, but the adversary already knows that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why they just overran 20 checkpoints in the last quarter.
Yeah.
So if anything, there's an obligation for the public and Congress to be aware of this and say, hey, this money being spent on building this force is not resulting in a capable force that can handle the adversary. So, a lot of that kind of stuff, we would battle back and forth about. At the same time, as a journalist and someone who is an advocate of transparency, I think there are also times where things get out in public that shouldn't be out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this whole concept of leaking is something that journalists in general love leaks
Mhm.
because it yields stories and scoops and exclusives. But I do struggle with that.
Yeah.
There are times where I feel like that leak was not in the public interest, and it was dangerous. There have been things going on in Ukraine, for example, with the counteroffensive that was taking place in September. I felt there was a lot of information prior to it that was being discussed that I'm not sure was a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Giving away too much information, telegraphing too much to the adversary about what units are where, what weapons are where, things like that. And so I get the importance of informing the public and an accounting of things and knowing how much money is being spent. But certain details, tactically speaking, you do need to hold back.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing. But I think back to the original question. I think there's no question that there is a bias and just a reflexive nature. And that's one of the things I wrote about in one of my stories earlier this year about allies, U.S. allies, so U.S., U.K., Canada,
Mhm.
Australia, trying to integrate their space capabilities.
Mhm. Mhm.
And all of them said one of the biggest barriers was overclassification
Mhm.
and not being able to share with each other.
Right.
And all of them said this needs to be fixed. The U.S. commander said we've got to change from a bias toward classifying and then finding reasons to declassify and start from it's unclassified until we have a reason to classify.
Right.
And but you hear this, but you also don't see a lot of change. I mean, this conversation's been going on for a long, long time.
We had it often when I was in the building, and,
Yeah.
General John Hyten, who is the vice chairman, he would raise this issue often. And you're exactly right. There are programs that absolutely have to be classified, or else and from the technology side, we lose our head. Oh, nice. I mean, I hate to admit it, but I saw programs that seemed to be classified only because in some cases they were so dumb they couldn't survive being exposed to the light of day. If they went through thorough review, they wouldn't have survived. What I really worry about is when you do those and people see those, they start to think that the whole classification system lacks credibility. And so when you have the example, the thing that you absolutely do have to classify, it becomes more questionable, frankly.
Yeah, it does. And this was something that what a lot of it came down to is you look at things, say, is this classified because it's sensitive or because it's embarrassing?
Right.
And with Afghan forces, I keep coming back to that, but that there were so many cases where the Defense Department was dialing back information it used to release because it wasn't showing progress. And so we would say, is this classified because there's potential harm or because it looks bad that Afghan forces actually lost ground last year? And so that, we would battle around that. And you're right to that point that if you're holding things back because it doesn't look good, that undermines the system, it undermines credibility,
Right.
and it certainly gives more ammunition to critics of programs and the departments. Um, but back to the challenge of changing it. It's just like so many things in the department, and one of the things that is frustrating for me at times as a journalist is how often I feel like I do the same story.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I did reporting in 2016 and 2017 on questions about classification and a lot of topics that as I came back into this space earlier in 2022, a lot of things hadn't moved,
Mhm.
despite years of people saying this is a problem, we know what the problem is, and even having a sense of what the fixes are, and yet they don't happen. Whether it's acquisitions reform. I mean, there's definitely been progress.
Yeah.
No question that things have gotten better, but you still hear a lot of the same complaints about acquiring technology, software, quickly evolving technologies.
Mhm.
Um, People say we're still using the same acquisitions authorities from 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
So this is, I think, one of the challenges with classification. People recognize it, um, but no one has really put forward sort of a clear roadmap to addressing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that as a journalist I really look for when I'm covering these topics. And I hear someone saying, we need acquisition reform, or we need a better cyber strategy, or we need to improve classification. Okay, you've been saying this for the last 10 years.
Mm.
If it hasn't progressed, why?
Yeah.
What are the barriers? What are the challenges to doing it? And what is the strategy to addressing those?
Yeah.
And so that's where I always try to push in reporting on these topics is, okay, we've heard this. If it's not happening, explain to us why.
Yeah.
And come up with a strategy to address those reasons why. Or do you ultimately acknowledge that some things just aren't going to be
In
aren't
which
going to be
case, yeah,
fixed?
yeah, they're gonna be
Um,
fixed. Let's move on, but that
yeah,
would be unfortunate.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think back to a number of years ago, I was involved in a study that addressed the very issue you raised about what was limiting cooperation between allies in the technology side, and it concluded that it was the lack of communication and the overclassification, and and the funny part about that story was after we outbriefed it, so one of our allies had heard about the study and asked if they could see a copy of it, and they were told no. So much for listening.
Yeah.
It just stopped right there at the study. So you've obviously, you've looked at many different aspects of national security, the national security enterprise. Is there a particular storyline that you think has been underreported or that deserves more attention?
So I'd say the one area that comes up a lot, it's not necessarily underreported, but it seems to cut through so many challenges, and it does get reported, but doesn't seem to get a lot of action, is around workforce.
Hmm.
Because so many things that I've covered whether it was focusing on cyber, for example. Say, okay, yes, you need strategy, we need certain authorities, but you always hear we need the workforce. We need the ability to recruit young cyber talent into the Army, into the services, into civilian positions. And there are challenges doing that because there aren't enough, American kids who are growing up and going into STEM programs and then graduating and then wanting to go into government positions. So you have the industry government challenge for a limited pool of Americans. And so you hear the same thing. I've covered energetic materials this year. What was one of the big problems they're saying? The workforce.
Right.
And getting people into that. The CHIPS law that was just signed. What's the big limiting factor there? The workforce. So it really...
almost every one of the technology areas that we look at in emerging technologies, you're exactly right.
Yeah, and so you have a constraint on the domestic workforce. You have a population, and of them, a certain percentage are interested in going into these fields. Of those who are interested, how many want to go into government versus private sector? So you've got that tension, that there's internal competition for a small pool. And then you've got the whole issue of immigration. And this is something that I remember reporting on this back, I think in 2008. At that time, the challenges of tech companies getting the workforce, and how many of them were going through great lengths to sponsor H-1B visas and having huge lead times to do it, huge uncertainty about whether they were going to come through. And again, clear need, and you have a pool of people. You have students coming from all over the world to the United States to get degrees, they get an education, and then they face incredible...
And they want to stay.
Right.
That's what people don't understand. The vast majority want to stay here.
Yeah.
Probably some for bad reasons, but a very small percentage.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, most of them came here for the education and work in the industry, and then the system is preventing it.
That's right. We make it difficult for them after we've invested.
And so I think that's another one that falls into this category of an identified problem for a long time that has had very little action taken. And Congress talks about, this is one that really is Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things that the department can do or that other agencies can do, but this one is a congressional problem, and there's really been very little action on that. So that's another where you just hear all the time for everyone saying, we need workers. And right now, this effort to onshore supply chain, and all this, it sounds great. It's great for American industry and national security, but where's the workforce going to come from?
Yeah.
So that, as I say, that just comes up in almost everything that I report, is the workforce constraint.
Sean, I'll make that the last word on this podcast. Again, thank you so much for first joining us for the podcast. Thank you so much for joining the NDIA team. Thank you for your contributions to this award-winning national, it truly is award-winning.
It is.
It's great to have you as a colleague, and I'm looking forward to our future interactions.
Thanks. Great to be with you,
Great.
Mark.